A young woman 8 months pregnant walks into a bustling city market and is never seen again. Her name was Isabella Rossi, a name that would soon be etched into the minds of a community gripped by fear. For weeks, her husband Marco and her family plastered her smiling face on every lamppost, their hope a flickering candle in a gathering storm. The city held its breath, praying for a miracle. But the knock on the door that finally came wasn't with good news. It was the police, their faces grim, holding a single chilling piece of evidence: Isabella's wedding dress stained with her blood. The mystery of her disappearance was just beginning, and the secrets it would uncover would tear a family apart, proving that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we invite into our own homes. The late afternoon sun of October 12, 2024, cast long amber shadows across the cobblestone streets of Florence, Italy. For Isabella Rossi, it was a day like any other, a day filled with the gentle kicks of her unborn son and the comforting weight of her husband Marco's hand in hers. At 28, Isabella was radiant, her dark hair a cascade of waves around a face that seemed to perpetually hold a soft, serene smile. 8 months into her first pregnancy, she carried the clumsy grace of impending motherhood, a joyful anticipation that seemed to color the very air around her. Marco, a man whose love for Isabella was as tangible as the ancient stones of their city, watched her from the doorway of their small apartment. He was a restorer of antique books, a man of quiet patience and deep passions, the foremost of which was his wife. "Be careful, my love," he called out, his voice a low melodic hum. "The market is a madhouse today." Isabella turned her hand resting on the swell of her belly. "I'll be fine, Marco. I just need some fresh basil for the pesto tonight, and maybe one of those little cannolis from Signora Moretti. The baby is demanding it." She winked a playful glint in her warm brown eyes. He chuckled, a sound that always made her heart flutter. "The baby has expensive taste." He walked to her, his large hands gently cupping her face. He kissed her, then a long, lingering kiss that tasted of coffee and a love that felt as old and enduring as the city itself. "Don't be long." "I won't," she promised, her voice muffled against his lips. With a final radiant smile, Isabella turned and walked down the narrow street, her light blue maternity dress a splash of color against the ochre and sienna of the buildings. Marco watched until she disappeared around the corner, a familiar, comfortable ache of love in his chest. He then returned to his workshop, the scent of old paper and binding glue a comforting cloak. He had a rare first edition of the Divine Comedy to restore a task that would usually consume him entirely. But that day, an unsettling disquiet nagged at the edge of his consciousness, a faint discordant note in the symphony of his contentment. He dismissed it as the anxieties of an expectant father. The hours bled into one another. The golden light of the afternoon faded into the bruised purple of twilight. The aroma of Marco's simmering tomato sauce filled their small apartment, but there was still no sign of Isabella. He checked his phone. No missed calls, no messages. A prickle of unease traced its way down his spine. She was never late, not without calling. He dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, the same disembodied voice. He called her mother Elena, a woman whose fiery spirit was matched only by her fierce love for her daughter. "Elena, is Isabella with you?" Marco's voice was tighter than he intended. "No, Marco. Why is everything all right?" A mother's intuition, sharp and immediate. "She went to the San Lorenzo market hours ago and hasn't returned. She's not answering her phone." A tense silence hung between them, thick with unspoken fears. "I'll be right there," Elena said, her voice strained. Marco then called Isabella's father, a stoic man named Lorenzo, and her younger sister Sofia. Within the hour, their small apartment was filled with the frantic energy of a family on the precipice of panic. Lorenzo, his face a mask of grim control, immediately started calling the local hospitals. Sophia, her eyes wide with the fear that mirrored Marco's, began a frantic social media campaign, posting Isabella's picture with desperate pleas for information. The night deepened a suffocating blanket of darkness. Marco, accompanied by Lorenzo, went to the police. The officer on duty, a weary man with tired eyes, listened patiently, his pen scratching across the report form. "It's only been a few hours, signore," he said, his tone meant to be reassuring but managing only to be dismissive. "She probably just met a friend, her phone died. These things happen." "Not with Isabella," Marco insisted, his voice raw. "She's 8 months pregnant. She would never just disappear." The officer sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "We'll file the report. If she doesn't turn up by morning, we'll start a formal investigation." The walk back to the apartment was a blur of streetlights and shadows. Marco's mind raced, replaying every moment of his last conversation with Isabella. Her smile, her wink, her promise. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, began to settle in his chest. The world he had so carefully built, a world centered around Isabella and their unborn child, was tilting on its axis. The days that followed were a living nightmare. The police, prodded by the family's relentless pressure, launched a full-scale investigation. They canvassed the San Lorenzo market, but no one remembered seeing a pregnant woman in a blue dress. It was as if she had dissolved into the bustling crowd, a ghost in the making. The media picked up the story, and Isabella's smiling face was suddenly everywhere. On television screens and newspapers, on the ever-present posters that Marco and a growing army of volunteers plastered on every available surface. "Have you seen Isabella Rossi?" The posters screamed a silent testament to a family's desperate hope. Weeks crawled by, each day a fresh wave of despair. Marco stopped working. He barely ate, barely slept. His waking hours were a torturous cycle of waiting for the phone to ring, for a knock on the door, for any news, any sign that his Isabella was alive. He would sit in their silent apartment, surrounded by the scent of her perfume that still lingered in the air, and talk to his unborn son, promising him that his mother would be home soon. The family, once a tight-knit unit, began to fray at the edges under the immense strain. Elena, her grief a raw, open wound, was a whirlwind of frantic energy, organizing search parties, hounding the police. Her hope a desperate flickering flame. Lorenzo, in contrast, retreated into a stoic silence, his face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have stolen his voice. Sophia, trying to be the strong one, the bridge between her grieving parents and her shattered brother-in-law, was crumbling under the weight of it all. And then 6 weeks after Isabella had vanished into the autumn air, the knock on the door finally came. It wasn't a neighbor with a casserole or a friend with words of comfort. It was 2 detectives, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a pity that made Marco's blood run cold. One of the detectives, a man named Inspector Ricci, held a large clear plastic bag. Inside, carefully folded, was a piece of clothing. Marco's breath caught in his throat. He recognized it instantly. The delicate lace, the intricate beadwork, the soft ivory silk. It was Isabella's wedding dress. The dress she had looked so ethereal in, the dress that symbolized the beginning of their life together. But it was wrong. Horribly, terrifyingly wrong. The pristine silk was marred by a dark, ugly stain, a stain that spread across the bodice like a grotesque flower. "Signor Rossi," Inspector Ricci said, his voice gentle but firm. "We found this in a dumpster on the outskirts of the city. We've had it tested." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "The blood is a match for your wife." The world, which had been tilting for weeks, finally shattered. Marco stared at the blood-stained dress, the symbol of his greatest joy, now a harbinger of his deepest horror. The questions that had been whispering in the dark corners of his mind now roared to the forefront. Who would do this? And why? The mystery of Isabella's disappearance had just taken a sinister, terrifying turn, and the secrets that were about to be unearthed would not only destroy the memory of the woman he loved, but would also threaten to consume his entire family in their devastating wake. The investigation into the life of Isabella Rossi was about to begin, And what they would find would prove that in the intricate tapestry of family, some threads are woven with deceit, and some secrets are buried in graves of their own making. The search for a missing person was over. A murder investigation had just begun. And the prime suspect in the eyes of the public and the ever-watchful media was the grieving husband who was the last to see her alive. The nightmare was far from over. It was just beginning. The discovery of the blood-stained wedding dress sent a shockwave through the Rossi and Moretti families, shattering the fragile hope they had clung to for 6 agonizing weeks. The media frenzy which had begun to subside erupted with renewed ferocity. The narrative shifted from a tragic disappearance to a suspected homicide, and the spotlight, harsh and unforgiving, swiveled to Marco. He was the grieving husband, the last person to see Isabella alive, and in the court of public opinion, that made him a person of interest. Inspector Ricci and his partner Detective Gallo became frequent visitors to the small Florentine apartment that now felt more like a tomb than a home. Their questions, once sympathetic, now carried a subtle probing edge. They went over the timeline of October 12th again and again, dissecting every minute of Marco's day. "You say you were restoring a book all afternoon, Signor Rossi?" Ricci asked during one of their interviews, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Yes, a first edition of the Divine Comedy," Marco answered, his voice a hoarse whisper. The lack of sleep and constant stress had taken their toll. He was a shadow of his former self, his clothes hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. "Did anyone see you? Can anyone verify that you were in your workshop all afternoon?" Gallo pressed his tone, less patient than his partner's. "I work alone," Marco replied, a flicker of irritation cutting through his grief. "My clients drop off the books. I work on them. They pick them up. That's how it's always been." The detectives exchanged a look, a silent communication that did not go unnoticed by Marco. He was being treated like a suspect. His grief invalidated, his love for Isabella questioned. The injustice of it was a bitter pill to swallow. The strain was also taking a devastating toll on Isabella's family. Elena, who had once been Marco's staunchest defender, now looked at him with a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The media's relentless speculation, coupled with the police's pointed questions, had planted a seed of suspicion that was beginning to take root. "Why the wedding dress, Marco?" she asked one evening, her voice trembling. They were in the apartment, the silence thick with unspoken accusations. Of all things, why her wedding dress? It was stored in the attic. How would a stranger know to look for it? "I don't know, Elena," Marco said, his voice breaking. "I don't know." He wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but all he could muster was a weary, defeated sigh. Lorenzo, Isabella's father, remained a silent, imposing figure in the background. His grief was a quiet, corrosive force, and his rare pronouncements were like judgments from on high. "The police are just doing their job," he said, his voice flat, his eyes unreadable. "If you have nothing to hide, Marco, you have nothing to fear." Sophia, caught between her loyalty to her sister's husband and her parents' growing suspicions, was in an impossible position. She saw Marco's pain, his utter devastation, and she couldn't bring herself to believe he was capable of harming Isabella. But the questions lingered, unwelcome and insidious. The investigation, meanwhile, was unearthing details about Isabella's life that painted a more complex picture than the serene, happy wife and mother-to-be that Marco knew. The police, digging into her phone records and bank statements, discovered that in the months leading up to her disappearance, Isabella had made several large cash withdrawals, a total of over 20,000 euros. "Did you know about this, Signor Rossi?" Inspector Ricci asked, sliding the bank statements across the table. Marco stared at the numbers, a feeling of bewilderment washing over him. "No," he said, shaking his head. "We had a joint account. I never saw these withdrawals. Where would the money have gone?" The question hung in the air, another piece of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly convoluted. The police also found a series of text messages on Isabella's phone from a number they couldn't trace that were cryptic and vaguely threatening. "You can't run from this," one message read. "He will find you. The past always catches up. Read another. Do you know who might have been threatening your wife, Signor Rossi? Gallo asked, his tone accusatory. No, Marco said, his mind reeling. Isabella never mentioned any threats. She never seemed scared or worried. But as he said the words, a memory surfaced, a small, seemingly insignificant detail from a few weeks before she vanished. He had come home early from his workshop and found Isabella on the phone, her back to him. Her voice was low and hushed, and she seemed agitated. When she saw him, she had ended the call abruptly, a flicker of something, fear, annoyance, in her eyes. Just a wrong number, she had said, her smile a little too bright, a little too forced. At the time he had thought nothing of it. Now it seemed like a glaring red flag, another sign that his wife had been hiding a part of her life from him. The secrets didn't stop there. As the police delved deeper into Isabella's past, they uncovered a chapter of her life that she had never spoken of, a time before she met Marco, a time she had spent in Rome. It turned out that Isabella had been involved with a man named Alessandro Bellini, a charismatic but dangerous figure with known ties to organized crime. The relationship had ended badly, and according to a friend the police interviewed, Isabella had fled Rome to escape him. This revelation hit Marco like a physical blow. The woman he had loved, the woman he thought he knew so intimately, had a past he knew nothing about. A past that involved a dangerous man. A past that might have gotten her killed. The discovery of Alessandro Bellini shifted the focus of the investigation, at least partially, away from Marco. The police now had another potential suspect, a man with a motive and a history of violence. But he was a ghost, a phantom from a past Isabella had tried to bury. Finding him would not be easy. For Marco, this new information was both a relief and a source of profound pain. It meant that there was another explanation for what had happened to his wife, an explanation that didn't involve him being a monster. But it also meant that Isabella had kept a significant part of her life a secret from him. The foundation of their relationship, which he had believed to be built on honesty and trust, now seemed to be riddled with cracks. The family was further fractured by this news. Elena was horrified, her grief now mixed with a sense of betrayal. "Why didn't she tell us?" she cried, her voice raw with anguish. "We could have protected her." Lorenzo, ever the pragmatist, saw it differently. "She was ashamed," he said, his voice heavy. "She made a mistake and she was trying to outrun it." Sophia, however, felt a surge of anger. "So we're just going to blame her now?" she demanded, her eyes flashing. "She's the victim here. She was running from a monster and he finally caught up with her." The arguments became more frequent, the silences more fraught with tension. The shared grief that had once united them was now a wedge driving them apart. As the investigation continued, the police managed to trace the untraceable number from Isabella's phone. It belonged to a burner phone, but they were able to triangulate its last known location. A small cafe in a quiet piazza not far from Marco and Isabella's apartment. The owner of the cafe, a stout balding man named Giorgio, remembered Isabella. She had been a regular in the weeks before she disappeared. But she hadn't been alone. She had been meeting with a man. He was older, Giorgio told the police, well-dressed with a sad look in his eyes. He couldn't remember his name, but he remembered their conversations. They were quiet, intense, and seemed to cause the pregnant woman a great deal of distress. The police showed Giorgio a picture of Alessandro Bellini. He shook his head. "No, that's not him. This man was different, gentler." The mystery had taken another turn. Isabella had not only been hiding a dangerous ex-boyfriend, but she had also been having secret meetings with an unknown man. The picture of the serene, happy pregnant woman was becoming increasingly blurred, replaced by a portrait of a woman with a complicated secret life. For Marco, each new revelation was a fresh stab of pain. He was no longer just grieving for his wife. He was grieving for the life he thought they had, for the woman he thought he knew. The blood-stained wedding dress was a symbol not just of her death, but of the death of their shared dreams, a love that he was beginning to realize was built on a foundation of lies. The cracks in the family were widening into chasms. The search for the truth was no longer just about finding Isabella's killer. It was about confronting the secrets and lies that had been festering beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. And as the investigation delved deeper into the shadows of Isabella's past, they were about to uncover a truth far more shocking and devastating than any of them could have ever imagined. The real drama was just beginning to unfold. The revelation that Isabella had been meeting a mysterious older man sent the investigation spiraling in a new direction. While the hunt for the elusive Alessandro Bellini continued, Inspector Ricci and Detective Gallo now had another lead to follow, another thread to pull in the increasingly tangled web of Isabella's secret life. For Marco, the news was another blow to his already shattered reality. He replayed the past few months in his mind, searching for any clue, any sign that he had missed. Had Isabella seemed distracted? Had there been any unexplained absences? Any hushed phone calls he hadn't paid enough attention to the image of her turning away from him? Ending that phone call so abruptly haunted him. It was a small moment, but it was now magnified, imbued with a sinister significance. He felt a growing sense of isolation. The police still viewed him with suspicion, and his relationship with Isabella's family was deteriorating by the day. Elena, once a source of comfort, now seemed to flinch at his touch. Lorenzo's silence was a constant heavy judgment. Only Sophia still offered a glimmer of support, but even she was struggling under the weight of her family's grief and the mounting pressure of the investigation. The media, of course, seized upon the new developments with renewed glee. The narrative of their grieving husband was now being supplanted by a more salacious story, a beautiful pregnant woman with a dark past, a dangerous ex-boyfriend, and a mysterious lover. Marco's face was splashed across the tabloids, his pained expression juxtaposed with headlines that screamed of betrayal and deceit. Meanwhile, the police were working tirelessly to identify the man from the cafe. They created a composite sketch based on Giorgio's description and began showing it around the neighborhood. It was a slow, painstaking process, but they finally got a break. A local librarian recognized the man. He was a regular at the library, a quiet, scholarly man named Antonio Giordano. The name meant nothing to Marco. He had never heard Isabella mention an Antonio Giordano. The police located Giordano's address and went to his apartment, a modest, book-filled flat in a quiet residential area. Antonio Giordano was a man in his late 60s with a gentle, melancholic air about him. He was a retired professor of art history, and when the police informed him of Isabella's death, his composure crumbled. He wept openly, a man consumed by a grief that seemed both profound and deeply personal. "I can't believe she's gone," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have done more to help her." The story he told the police was a bombshell, a revelation that would once again rewrite the narrative of Isabella's life and death. Antonio Giordano was not her lover. He was her father. Her biological father. The story was a long and complicated one, a tale of a youthful romance, a secret pregnancy, and a difficult choice. Elena, Isabella's mother, had had a brief, passionate affair with Antonio when they were both young students. When she discovered she was pregnant, she had made the difficult decision to end the relationship and raise the child with Lorenzo, who had been her steadfast, devoted friend. Lorenzo had agreed to raise Isabella as his own, and they had never told her the truth. But secrets, as the Rossi family was learning, have a way of coming to the surface. A few months ago, Antonio, recently widowed and feeling the weight of his mortality, had decided to find the daughter he had never known. He had hired a private investigator who had located Isabella in Florence. He had reached out to her, and after the initial shock, Isabella had agreed to meet him. Their secret meetings at the cafe had been her attempt to come to terms with this life-altering revelation, to get to know the man who was her biological father. This new information sent a fresh wave of shock and grief through the family. Elena was forced to confess her long-held secret to a stunned and devastated Lorenzo. The stoic, silent man was finally broken, his quiet grief erupting into a raw, painful display of anger and betrayal. The foundation of their marriage, which had seemed so solid, was revealed to be built on a lie. For Sophia, the news was a confusing mix of emotions. She felt a surge of sympathy for her mother for the difficult choice she had made as a young woman. But she also felt a deep sadness for her father, who had been deceived for so many years. and she grieved for her sister who had been carrying this heavy secret alone. Marco, listening to this story unfold at the police station, felt a profound sense of sorrow. He finally understood Isabella's agitation, her secret meetings, her large cash withdrawals. Antonio explained that Isabella had been helping him. He had fallen on hard times after his wife's long illness, and Isabella, out of a sense of compassion and a burgeoning sense of familial duty, had been giving him money to help him get back on his feet. The threatening text messages, however, remained a mystery. Antonio swore he had nothing to do with them. He had only wanted to know his daughter not to harm her. The revelation about Antonio Giordano cleared up some of the questions surrounding Isabella's final weeks, but it also opened up a new line of inquiry. The police now had to consider the possibility that her death was connected to this long-buried family secret. Had someone from Elena's or Lorenzo's past discovered the truth and sought revenge? The focus of the investigation now turned to Alessandro Bellini, the dangerous ex-boyfriend from Rome. The police intensified their search, believing that he was the most likely source of the threatening text messages. They discovered that he had recently been released from prison and had been trying to re-establish his criminal enterprise. They also learned that he had been asking about Isabella, trying to find out where she was. The theory was that Bellini had discovered Isabella was pregnant and had become obsessed with the idea that the child was his. The threatening messages were his way of trying to intimidate her, to force her to come back to him. The police finally got a lead on Bellini's whereabouts. An informant told them that he was hiding out in a run-down apartment building on the outskirts of Naples. A raid was organized, and a team of heavily armed officers stormed the building. They found Bellini, but it was too late. He was dead, a single gunshot wound to the chest. The scene was staged to look like a suicide, but the forensics team quickly determined that it was a professional hit. The death of Alessandro Bellini was another shocking twist in a case that was already overflowing with them. It seemed that the ghost from Isabella's past had been silenced, but by whom? Had he been killed by his criminal rivals, or was his death connected to Isabella's? The investigation was now more complicated than ever. They had a dead pregnant woman, a blood-stained wedding dress, a secret biological father, a dead gangster, ex-boyfriend, and a family that was imploding under the weight of its own secrets. For Marco, the world had become a surreal, nightmarish landscape. Every time he thought he was getting closer to the truth, it receded further into the distance, replaced by a new set of lies and deceptions. He was a man adrift in a sea of grief and confusion, with no land in sight. The police, however, were not giving up. They continued to dig, to sift through the wreckage of the Rossi family's lives, convinced that the key to solving Isabella's murder lay somewhere in the tangled mess of her past. And as they focused their attention back on the family, on the raw emotions and festering resentments that had been exposed, they began to suspect that the killer might not be a ghost from the past, but someone much closer to home. Someone who had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. The real monster, they were beginning to realize, might be one of their own. The investigation was about to take its most sinister and heartbreaking turn yet. The death of Alessandro Bellini, far from simplifying the investigation, only served to deepen the mystery. It was a dead end, a silencing of a voice that might have held some of the answers. The police were back to square one, with a growing list of questions and a shrinking list of suspects. The focus of the investigation now shifted back to the family, to the intricate web of relationships and resentments that had been laid bare. Inspector Ricci, a man with a keen understanding of human nature, knew that in cases like this the truth was often buried under layers of love, jealousy, and betrayal. He started by re-interviewing the family members one by one, probing for inconsistencies, for any sign of deception. He started with Elena, a woman who was now a shadow of her former self, her fiery spirit extinguished by grief and guilt. "Tell me about your relationship with Lorenzo," Ricci asked, his voice gentle but firm, "after you told him about Antonio." Elena hesitated, her eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. "It was difficult," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "He was hurt, angry. He felt like our whole life had been a lie." Did he blame you? Ricci pressed. He blamed everyone, she said, a flicker of her old fire returning. He blamed me. He blamed Antonio. He even blamed Isabella. He said she should have never agreed to meet him, that she had brought this trouble on all of us. This was a new piece of information. The stoic, silent Lorenzo was not just grieving. He was angry, and he was blaming his own daughter. Next, Ricci interviewed Sophia. She was defensive, fiercely protective of her family, but her loyalty was clearly being tested. My parents are good people, she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. They're just in pain. They're not thinking clearly. And Marco, Ricci asked, his gaze steady, how is he fitting into this new family dynamic? Sophia sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. It's awful, she said. My mother can barely look at him. My father treats him like he's a criminal. And Marco, he's just lost. He's trying to hold on, but he's all alone. The interview with Lorenzo was the most challenging. He was a man locked in a fortress of silence, his grief a shield that deflected all attempts to get through. I loved my daughter, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I would have done anything for her. But you were angry with her, Ricci said, his tone more of a statement than a question. You were angry that she was meeting with her biological father. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. She was naive, he said, his voice tight with a suppressed emotion that could have been anger or pain or both. She didn't understand the world. She trusted people too easily. As the interviews continued, a picture began to emerge of a family in turmoil. A family where resentment simmered beneath the surface, where love and anger were intertwined in a complex and dangerous dance. The police also continued to dig into the forensic evidence. They re-examined the blood-stained wedding dress, searching for any clue they might have missed. And they found something. A single strand of hair, not Isabella's, caught in the delicate beadwork of the bodice. The hair was sent for DNA testing, and the results came back with a shocking match. The hair did not belong to Marco or Antonio Giordano or Alessandro Bellini. It belonged to Sophia. The discovery sent a jolt through the investigation. Sophia, the quiet, supportive sister, the one who had seemed to be the glue holding the family together, was now a prime suspect. The police brought her in for questioning again. This time the atmosphere was different. The friendly, sympathetic facade was gone, replaced by a cold, hard professionalism. We found your hair on Isabella's wedding dress, Sophia. Inspector Ricci said, his voice devoid of warmth. Sophia's face went pale. What? That's impossible, she stammered. Her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Is it? Gallo countered, his voice sharp. Were you at Marco and Isabella's apartment on the day she disappeared? No, she said, shaking her head frantically. I was at work. I have colleagues who can verify that. Her alibi checked out. She had been at the art gallery where she worked as a curator all day. But the hair was a physical piece of evidence that could not be ignored. The police were now faced with a new puzzle. How did Sophia's hair get on the wedding dress? Had she been there at some point before or after the murder? Or was there another explanation? They decided to search Sophia's apartment. It was a small, tastefully decorated flat filled with books on art history and catalogs from various exhibitions. It seemed like the home of a quiet, intellectual woman, not a killer. But in her bedroom, tucked away in a drawer beneath a pile of sweaters, they found something that made their blood run cold. A small leather-bound diary. The diary was a record of Sophia's innermost thoughts and feelings, a place where she had poured out all the frustrations and resentments that she had kept hidden from the world. And it was a chilling read. The diary revealed that Sophia had been secretly in love with Marco for years. She had watched him fall in love with her sister, had stood by as they got married and started a life together, all the while nursing a silent, all-consuming jealousy. She wrote about her resentment of Isabella, of her seemingly perfect life, her effortless beauty, her easy happiness. She wrote about her frustration with her parents, who she felt had always favored her older sister. But the most disturbing entries were from the past few months. She wrote about her growing obsession with Marco, her fantasies of a life with him, a life where Isabella was no longer in the picture. "He deserves better than her," she wrote in one entry. "She has her secrets. She's not the perfect wife he thinks she is. He deserves someone who will love him unconditionally, someone like me." The diary was emotive, a dark, twisted confession of a love that had curdled into a dangerous obsession. But it wasn't a confession of murder. When confronted with the diary, Sophia broke down completely. She confessed to her love for Marco, to her jealousy of her sister, but she vehemently denied killing her. "I loved her," she sobbed, her body racked with guilt and shame. "I was jealous of her, yes, but I would never hurt her. She was my sister." The police were skeptical. They had a motive, they had a physical link to the crime scene, and they had a suspect who was emotionally unstable. But they still didn't have a confession, and there were still pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. How did Sophia, who was at work all day, manage to kill her sister, dispose of the body, and then plant the blood-stained wedding dress? The investigation had reached a critical point. They were closer than ever to the truth, but it was a truth that was more shocking and more tragic than they could have ever imagined. The focus of the investigation now narrowed to one crucial question: was Sophia a spurned lover who had snapped and killed her sister in a fit of jealous rage, or was she just another victim in a much larger, more sinister game? The police were about to uncover the final devastating piece of the puzzle, a secret that had been hidden in plain sight all along, a secret that would not only solve the mystery of Isabella's death, but would also destroy what was left of the once happy family. The real drama was about to reach its shattering climax. The discovery of Sophia's diary and her secret obsession with Marco threw the investigation into a frenzy. The media, which had been circling the story like vultures, descended with renewed vigor. The narrative of the grieving sister was now replaced with the tantalizing story of a Cain and Abel-like betrayal, a sisterly love twisted into a deadly jealousy. For Marco, the revelation was another disorienting blow. He looked at Sophia, the woman who had been his friend, his confidant, his sister-in-law, and saw a stranger. The kindness and support she had shown him now seemed manipulative, her grief a carefully constructed performance. The thought that she might have been responsible for Isabella's death was a betrayal so profound it was almost incomprehensible. The family, already fractured and broken, was completely shattered. Elena, who had already lost one daughter, was now faced with the possibility that her other daughter was a murderer. The weight of it was too much to bear. She retreated into a world of silent, inconsolable grief, a ghost in her own home. Lorenzo, however, reacted with a surprising ferocity. He refused to believe that Sophia was guilty. "She's not a killer," he insisted, his voice raw with a father's desperate conviction. "She's just a mixed-up kid. She loved her sister." The police, however, were building a strong case against Sophia. They had a motive. They had a physical link to the crime scene, and they had a suspect who was emotionally volatile. But there were still nagging inconsistencies, pieces of the puzzle that refused to fit. The biggest problem was Sophia's alibi. She had been at the art gallery all day on October 12th, and her colleagues had confirmed it. It seemed impossible that she could have committed the crime. Inspector Ricci, a man who trusted his gut as much as he trusted the evidence, felt that something was still off. He decided to go back to the beginning to re-examine every piece of evidence, every statement, every timeline. He was looking for something small, something that had been overlooked, a tiny crack in the carefully constructed wall of lies and deception. He started with the wedding dress. It had been found in a dumpster on the outskirts of the city, a location that was not on any of Sophia's regular routes. It was a detail that had been bothering him from the beginning. Why would she go so far out of her way to dispose of it? He decided to visit the location again, to walk the area to see if there was anything he had missed. It was a desolate industrial area. a place of abandoned warehouses and graffiti-covered walls. As he was walking, he noticed something. A small independent bookstore tucked away between a derelict factory and a boarded-up shop. It was the kind of place that would have interested Marco, a man who loved old books. On a hunch, Ricci went inside. The owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, remembered Marco. He had been a customer for years. "He was in here about a month ago," the old man said, "looking for a rare edition of Petrarch's sonnets." Ricci's heart started to pound. He pulled out a calendar and pointed to the date. October 12th. The old man squinted at the calendar. "Yes," he said. "That's the day. I remember because he seemed so agitated, so upset, not like his usual self at all." The alibi that had seemed so solid was beginning to crumble. Marco had not been in his workshop all afternoon as he had claimed. He had been on the other side of the city, near the place where the wedding dress had been found. Ricci now had a new line of inquiry. He went back to the police station and pulled the security camera footage from the area around the bookstore. And he found what he was looking for. A grainy black and white image of Marco's car driving away from the industrial area on the afternoon of October 12th. The timeline was tight, but it was possible. He could have driven to the industrial area, disposed of the dress, and then driven back to his apartment before his in-laws arrived. The investigation now turned its full force on Marco. The grieving husband, the man who had seemed so devastated by his wife's disappearance, was now the prime suspect. They brought him in for questioning again. This time there was no pretense of sympathy. They laid out the evidence in front of him, the security camera footage, the bookstore owner's statement, the lies about his whereabouts. Marco's composure, which had been so carefully maintained for weeks, finally shattered. He stared at the evidence, his face a mask of disbelief, and then he began to talk. The story he told was a tragic, convoluted tale of a marriage that had been slowly unraveling, of a love that had been eroded by secrets and lies. He confessed that he had discovered Isabella's secret meetings with Antonio Giordano. He had followed her, had seen them together at the cafe. He had confronted her, and they had had a terrible fight. "She told me everything," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and pain. "About Antonio, about her past with Bellini, about the money she had been giving him. She had been lying to me for months." In a fit of rage and betrayal, he had packed a bag and had told her he was leaving. He had driven aimlessly for hours, his mind in a turmoil. He had ended up at the bookstore, a place that had always brought him comfort. But he swore he had not killed her. "When I came back to the apartment," he said, his voice breaking, "she was gone." He had panicked. He had assumed that she had left him, that she had gone to be with her real father. He had been ashamed, humiliated, and he had lied to the police, to her family, to everyone. The story was plausible, but it was also self-serving. It explained his lies, but it didn't absolve him. And then the forensics team came back with another piece of evidence, another shocking twist in a case that was already full of them. They had re-examined the hair found on the wedding dress, this time using a more advanced DNA sequencing technique. The hair did not belong to Sophia. It belonged to Elena. The investigation had taken another sharp, sickening turn. Elena, the grieving mother, the woman who had seemed so consumed by her loss, was now a suspect. The police went to her house, but she was gone. She had packed a bag and disappeared. Lorenzo was frantic, convinced that she had done something terrible to herself. A manhunt was launched, and after a frantic 24-hour search, they found her. She was at a small, secluded hotel on the coast, registered under a false name. When the police entered her room, she was sitting on the bed, staring out at the sea. She was calm, eerily so. And she was ready to confess. The story she told was the final devastating piece of the puzzle, a story of a mother's love twisted into a tragic, misguided act of protection. She had known about Isabella's meetings with Antonio. She had been terrified that the secret she had kept for so long would come out, that it would destroy her family, that it would ruin her daughter's life. On the afternoon of October 12th, after Marco had stormed out, Elena had gone to the apartment to talk to Isabella. She had begged her to stop seeing Antonio, to forget about the past. But Isabella had refused. She had been determined to have a relationship with her biological father. They had argued, their voices rising in a crescendo of anger and desperation. Elena, in a state of panic, had grabbed Isabella by the arms, shaking her, trying to make her see reason. And then the unthinkable had happened. Isabella, 8 months pregnant, and already in a fragile state, had stumbled backward. She had hit her head on the sharp corner of a marble-topped table. She had fallen to the floor unconscious, a trickle of blood seeping from a wound on her head. Elena, horrified, had tried to revive her, but it was too late. Isabella was gone. The story was a tragic accident, a mother's desperate act that had gone horribly, fatally wrong. But what happened next was a cold, calculated act of self-preservation. Panicked and terrified, Elena had decided to cover up the crime. She had enlisted the help of the one person she knew she could trust, the one person who had always been her silent, steadfast protector, her husband Lorenzo. The final shocking truth was about to be revealed, a truth that would prove that in the dark, twisted world of the Rossi family, nothing was as it seemed. The real monster was not a jealous sister or a spurned lover or a ghost from the past. It was a parent's love twisted into a deadly, unforgivable sin. The final act of the tragedy was about to unfold. The interrogation room was cold and silent. Across the metal table, Elena Rossi sat with an unnerving calm, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the walls. She was ready to talk. Her voice, when it came, was a monotone whisper, recounting the events of that fateful afternoon. After Marco had stormed out, Elena had gone to the apartment, desperate to reason with Isabella. She had begged her daughter to end the meetings with Antonio Giordano, terrified that the secret she had guarded for nearly 30 years would shatter their family. Isabella, fiercely independent, refused. She wanted to know her biological father. The argument escalated, their voices raw with a lifetime of unspoken tensions. In a fit of panicked desperation, Elena grabbed her daughter's arms, shaking her. "You don't understand what you're doing," she had screamed. It happened in an instant. Isabella stumbled backward, off balance. The sharp marble corner of a console table met her head with a sickening crack. She collapsed to the floor, and in that horrifying moment of silence, Elena knew her daughter and her unborn grandchild were gone. Panic gave way to a cold, primal instinct for self-preservation. She didn't call an ambulance. She called Lorenzo. He arrived to the horrific scene and without a word understood what he had to do. His stoic devotion to his wife twisted into a new dark purpose to protect her at all costs. Together they concocted a chilling narrative of a violent murder. They hid Isabella's body in a hidden wine cellar in their basement, a tomb no one knew existed. Then came the masterstroke of their deception: the wedding dress. It was Lorenzo's idea, a piece of theater designed to inflame the media and point the investigation toward a crime of passion, a crime Marco could be blamed for. Elena retrieved the dress and with trembling hands stained the ivory silk with her own daughter's blood. Lorenzo then drove to the city's industrial outskirts and tossed the bag into a dumpster, a calculated act to create a trail of false clues. Her confession unraveled the entire mystery. It was Elena's hair on the dress. Marco's lies about his whereabouts and Sophia's jealous diary had been convenient distractions that made them perfect scapegoats. Based on her words, police found Isabella's remains. The autopsy confirmed a tragic accident, but the cover-up was a cold, deliberate crime. Elena and Lorenzo Rossi were arrested, charged with obstruction of justice and desecration of a body. The news exploded across the city. The monsters weren't a jilted lover or a ghost from the past. They were a mother and father whose possessive love had become a destructive force, leading them to bury one child to save themselves. The convictions of Elena and Lorenzo Rossi brought no closure, only a hollow, aching emptiness. The media circus moved on, but for those left in the wreckage, the aftermath was a life sentence of silent suffering. Marco sold the apartment, a tomb of memories he could no longer inhabit. he moved to a small coastal town seeking anonymity from the shadow of the tragedy. He returned to restoring old books, finding a quiet solace in mending what was broken, though he knew he himself was beyond repair. A changed man, he was haunted not only by the loss of his wife and child, but by the agonizing question of whether he had ever truly known Isabella at all. Sophia was left to pick up the pieces of a family shattered by betrayal. Her visits to her parents in prison were strained rituals of grief and unspoken accusations. She could not forgive them. Their love had been a monstrous destructive force that had stolen her sister and her own innocence. Abandoning her career, she dedicated herself to a foundation for victims of hidden abuse, a desperate attempt to create meaning from the senselessness. Antonio Giordano, the unwitting catalyst, retreated into a life of solitary guilt. He had found his daughter only to lose her, and he would forever be tormented by the thought that if he had never come looking for her, she might still be alive. The city of Florence eventually forgot Isabella Rossi. But for the survivors, the scars remained a permanent reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating power of secrets. The story ends not with justice, but with a profound lingering sadness. A husband mourning a stranger, a sister betrayed by her parents, and a family destroyed from within by a love that had become an unforgivable sin. The drama was over, but the suffering was eternal. Conclusion for YouTube video. The story of Isabella Rossi is a chilling reminder that the most devastating secrets are often hidden within the four walls of a family home. It's a tragedy born not from the hands of a stranger in the dark, but from a love that became twisted, possessive, and ultimately deadly. What began as a mother's desperate attempt to protect a long-buried secret spiraled into a web of deceit that ensnared everyone she loved, leading to an accidental death and a cold-blooded cover-up that tore a family to shreds. The real horror wasn't just the loss of a vibrant young woman and her unborn child, but the realization that the people she should have been safest with were the architects of her demise. Thank you for joining us on this heartbreaking journey. The water in Alistair Finch's infinity pool was the color of a billionaire's dream, a shimmering, impossible turquoise that bled into the California sky. But dreams can drown. When Genevieve Dubois, Alistair's brilliant and beautiful partner, vanished after a vicious fight, he told police she just needed space. Days later, while the search was still on, the music at his estate was blasting. Champagne flowed as his new lover, Portia Montgomery, played hostess to a lavish pool party. It was a brazen spectacle of wealth and indifference, until the sirens cut through the laughter and police began to drain the water, searching for a truth everyone feared was at the bottom. The fight, like all their fights, had started over something small and ended with the world cracking open. It was a Tuesday night in the Oak Haven Hills, an enclave of obscene wealth and paranoid privacy, nestled in the canyons above Los Angeles. From their glass-walled fortress, Alistair Finch and Genevieve Dubois could watch the city glitter below like a carpet of fallen stars, a universe away from the silent, suffocating perfection of their lives. This time, the catalyst was a painting. Genevieve's painting. It was a chaotic swirl of deep indigos and violent slashes of crimson, a piece she'd titled Escape Velocity. Alistair, a man who built his empire on the clean, predictable lines of venture capitalism, hated it. "It's aggressive, Jen," he'd said, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. He wasn't looking at the canvas, but at its reflection in the panoramic window, as if the art itself was too unrefined for his direct gaze. "It doesn't match the aesthetic." "It's not supposed to match the aesthetic." "Alistair," Genevieve replied, her voice low and tight. She was wiping her turpentine-stained hands on a rag, her slender frame tense. At 34, she still possessed the fiery spirit of the art student he'd met a decade ago, but it was banked now, smothered under layers of couture and compromise. It's supposed to feel something, and what it feels is chaotic, uncontrolled. He finally turned to her, his smile not reaching the cold calculation in his gray eyes. It was the smile he used on corporate boards before a hostile takeover. "I've invited the board of Arion Dynamics for dinner on Friday. I was thinking we'd hang the Rothko in its place. It's more conducive to billion-dollar conversations. The condescension was a physical blow. The Rothko wasn't a Rothko. It was his Rothko, an investment. Her painting was her soul, and he wanted to replace it with a balance sheet. No, she said the word, a small hard stone in the vast minimalist space. Alistair's smile tightened. No, it stays. The board can look at it and feel something for once in their lives. That was the spark. The argument that followed was a well-rehearsed tragedy. It spiraled from the painting to her lack of gratitude to his obsession with control to her friends he deemed unworthy to the woman he was seeing on the side, a sleek, ambitious lawyer named Portia Montgomery, whom everyone knew about but no one dared mention. Genevieve had thrown that name into the air, and it had hung there, a poisonous vapor. "Don't you dare!" Alistair had warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He took a step closer, his 6'3" frame eclipsing her. "Don't you dare bring her into this house." "She's already in this house," Genevieve had screamed, her voice finally breaking. "She's in our bed. She's in your head. She's in every single lie you tell me when you come home smelling of a perfume that isn't mine." The final ugly words were swallowed by the slamming of the solid oak studio door. Genevieve had stormed out, grabbing only her car keys and her worn leather handbag. Alistair, left alone in the cavernous living room, had watched the taillights of her vintage convertible snake down their private mile-long driveway until they were just another pair of red dots swallowed by the city's glow. He took a sip of his scotch, straightened his tie, and went to bed. He called the police 48 hours later. Detective Marcus Thorne felt a prickle of disdain the moment he stepped into the Finch estate. It wasn't just the opulence, the soaring ceilings, the museum-quality furniture, the sheer audacious scale of it all. It was the sterility. The house felt less like a home and more like a high-end showroom where no one was allowed to touch anything. Alistair Finch was the picture of concerned distress. He was dressed in a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks, his salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed. He wrung his hands at the appropriate moments, and his voice was thick with what sounded to the untrained ear like fear. "We had a quarrel," Alistair explained, seated on a white sofa that probably cost more than Thorne's car. "A stupid argument. She's passionate, you see. An artist. She gets overwhelmed. She's done this before. Takes off for a day or two to clear her head. Stays with a friend in Topanga, maybe gets a hotel by the beach." "And you have the names of these friends?" Thorne asked, his pen poised over his notepad. His partner, Detective Kim Holloway, a sharp woman half his age, was already scanning the room, her eyes missing nothing. Alistair waved a dismissive hand. "A few. I can have my assistant compile a list. But honestly, Detective, she values her privacy, her independence. If she knew I'd called you, she'd be furious." He was trying to frame it as an overreaction, an invasion of her space, not a dereliction of his duty. "She left her phone," Holloway noted from across the room. She was standing by a marble countertop where a single iPhone sat stark and silent. Her wallet, too. Credit cards, ID. The only thing missing is her handbag and the car keys. Thorne looked at Alistair. "Is that normal, Mr. Finch? For her to leave with no phone, no money?" Alistair's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, the only crack in his polished veneer. "She can be impulsive. She likely has cash in her bag. She's an old soul like that." Thorne made a note. Impulsive. He looked around the vast, silent house. "You said she drove off. We've put an APB out on her vehicle, a 1968 Mercedes 280 SL convertible, silver blue." "Correct. Yes, that's her baby," Alistair said with a sad, fond smile that felt utterly rehearsed. "And you haven't heard from her at all. No texts, no calls, no cryptic emails. Nothing. The silence is deafening." Thorne stood up, his gaze drifting past Alistair through the floor-to-ceiling windows to the backyard. It was a masterpiece of landscape architecture, manicured lawns, and outdoor kitchen that rivaled most professional restaurants, and the pool. The infinity pool was the centerpiece, a sheet of turquoise silk that seemed to pour directly into the canyon below. It was serene. "Perfect. We'll do everything we can." Mr. Finch, Thorne said, his tone professional, betraying none of his internal suspicions. "We'll check with the friends, monitor her bank accounts for any activity." "Oh, wait. You said her wallet is here. We'll keep an eye out for the car. In the meantime, if she contacts you, you call us immediately." "Of course, Detective. Thank you for your time." Alistair walked them to the door, a gracious host seeing off his guests. As they walked back to their unmarked sedan, Holloway broke the silence. "He's lying." "I know," Thorne said, starting the engine. "The question isn't whether he's lying. It's what he's lying about." Over the next 5 days, the disappearance of Genevieve Dubois became a minor story in the relentless Los Angeles news cycle. Artist partner of venture capitalist Alistair Finch missing. Her photo was everywhere, a candid shot from a gallery opening, her smile wide and genuine, her eyes sparkling with a light that seemed absent from the cold, sterile house she shared with him. Friends were interviewed. They all said the same thing: Jen was unhappy. Jen felt trapped. Jen was terrified of Alistair's temper. One friend, a sculptor named Maya, told Thorne that Genevieve had a secret bank account, a runaway fund, but a check of her financials showed it hadn't been touched in months. The car was found on day 4. It was parked legally on a quiet residential street in Venice Beach, miles from her usual haunts. It was clean. No signs of a struggle. Her handbag was on the passenger seat. Inside was a book of poetry and a half-eaten bar of dark chocolate. No cash, no keys, just the bag. Keys. Just. The discovery of the car without a body should have been a sign of hope, but to Detective Thorne it felt like a prop carefully placed on a stage. And then on Saturday, exactly 1 week after Genevieve Dubois had vanished into the night, the music started pumping from the Oakhaven Hills. Thorne got the call from a furious neighbor, a film producer whose own weekend tranquility was being shattered by the thumping bass. "You won't believe this," the producer had seethed over the phone. "The man's wife is missing, maybe dead, and he's throwing a goddamn rave." Thorne and Holloway drove back up the winding canyon road, not towards a crime scene, but towards a party. It was a vision of grotesque denial. Cars, Porsches, Bentleys, Teslas lined the private drive. Laughter and shrill voices echoed in the twilight air. As they approached the house, they could see the backyard. It was packed. Dozens of people, the young, beautiful, and wealthy of L.A., milled around the pool. Waiters in crisp white jackets served champagne. And in the center of it all, holding court like a king, was Alistair Finch. By his side, her hand resting possessively on his arm, was a stunning woman with raven black hair and a shark smile. Portia Montgomery. She looked perfectly at home. Thorne felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just arrogance. This was a statement. This was a man so convinced of his own power that he believed he was untouchable. He looked at the pool, the water glowing under the submerged lights, its surface disturbed by the joyful splashing of intoxicated guests. He thought of the missing woman, the fake smile of her partner, the car left like a breadcrumb. Something was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. And Thorne had a sickening feeling that the answer was somewhere in that shimmering turquoise water. The music didn't just play. It pulsed. A deep synthetic heartbeat that vibrated through the flagstone patio, up through the soles of Detective Thorne's sensible shoes, and into his teeth. It was a soundtrack for oblivion, a frantic attempt to blast away any creeping sense of reality. As Thorne and Holloway walked through the wide-open glass doors into the backyard, a wave of expensive perfume and champagne-scented air washed over them. Young men in designer shirts that were artfully unbuttoned stood in tight clusters with women whose faces were smooth, emotionless masks of Botox and ambition. They laughed too loudly, their eyes darting around, constantly assessing who was watching them, who they should be talking to. It was a gathering of people who treated life as a transaction, and Genevieve's disappearance was just a piece of unfortunate market volatility. Alistair saw them coming. He was holding a champagne flute, leaning against the marble edge of the outdoor bar. Portia Montgomery was at his side, her red dress a slash of defiance against the cool blues and whites of the party's aesthetic. She whispered something in his ear, and his expression shifted from convivial host to irritated monarch. He met the detectives halfway, a practiced smile of annoyance on his face. "Detectives, to what do I owe the pleasure? Did you find her? Is that why you're interrupting my gathering?" The choice of the word gathering was deliberate, an attempt to downplay the bacchanalian scene unfolding behind him. "No, Mr. Finch, we haven't found her," Thorne said, his voice flat and unimpressed. He let his gaze sweep over the partygoers, many of whom were now staring, their conversations faltering. "We're here because we received a complaint. And frankly, we're surprised. A man whose partner is the subject of a major missing persons investigation doesn't usually throw a party a week later." Alistair let out a short, humorless laugh. "This isn't a party, detective. It's a remembrance. A celebration of Genevieve's vibrant spirit. She wouldn't want us to sit around moping. She loved life. She loved people." It was the most audacious, self-serving lie Thorne had ever heard. He glanced at Portia, who stepped forward, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "Alistair was devastated, detective," she said, her voice a low, purring contralto. "I simply couldn't let him wallow in grief. We all process loss in our own way. Alistair is a man of action, of forward momentum. Staying positive, staying surrounded by life, it's how he copes." She placed her hand on Alistair's chest, a gesture of both support and ownership. "I see," Holloway said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "And you are Portia Montgomery?" "A friend of the family," she answered smoothly. The friend of the family, currently wearing a diamond necklace that belonged to the missing woman, Thorne thought. He'd seen the necklace in photos of Genevieve from a charity gala months earlier. It was a distinctive piece, a cascade of white gold and diamonds that he was sure hadn't been a gift to Ms. Montgomery. The brazenness was breathtaking. "Mr. Finch, we need to ask you and Ms. Montgomery to come down to the station to answer some more questions," Thorne stated, changing tactics. "There are inconsistencies in your timeline that need clarification." Alistair's face darkened. The mask of the gracious host slipped, revealing the tyrant beneath. "That's not going to happen. Not tonight. My lawyer has advised me not to speak further without him present. I've told you everything I know. This is harassment." "Is it?" Thorne challenged, taking a step closer, lowering his voice so only the three of them could hear. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a man who couldn't wait to replace his missing partner. It looks like a man celebrating his newfound freedom." Alistair's eyes blazed with fury. "You are on my private property. I'm asking you to leave. Now." "We'll leave," Thorne said calmly. "But we'll be back." He looked past Alistair, his eyes settling on the pool. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water. The turquoise surface, once so inviting, now looked dark and secretive. "We just need to make a stop at a judge's house first." Portia's perfectly sculpted composure flickered. A knot of anxiety tightened in her expression. "A judge? For what? A warrant?" Holloway supplied her gaze, locking onto Portia. "A warrant to search this entire property. Every room, every closet, every inch of the grounds." She paused, letting the weight of her next words land. "And to drain the pool." The silence that fell between them was more profound than the thumping music. Alistair's face went rigid. It wasn't the explosive anger Thorne had expected, but something colder, more terrifying. It was the look of a man whose meticulous calculations had just been thrown into chaos by an unpredictable variable. "You have no grounds," Alistair hissed. "I have a missing woman who left behind her phone and wallet," Thorne countered, ticking the points off on his fingers. "A car abandoned miles from her home. A partner with a history of a volatile temper, according to friends. A brand new girlfriend wearing what appears to be the missing woman's jewelry. And a party that looks a hell of a lot like a victory celebration. I think a judge will find that more than sufficient grounds for probable cause." Portia's hand, still on Alistair's chest, was trembling slightly. Her eyes were wide with a fear she could no longer conceal. She looked from Alistair to Thorne, then at the enormous glittering pool behind them. The laughter of the guests suddenly sounded shrill and distant, like ghosts at a feast. Alistair Finch, the man who controlled boardrooms and markets and people, was no longer in control of his own home. He stared at Thorne, his mind clearly racing, cycling through threats, bribes, and legal maneuvers. But he could see the implacable resolve in the detective's eyes. This wasn't a negotiation. "Get out," Alistair said again, but this time the words lacked their earlier force. They were brittle, desperate. "We're going," Thorne confirmed. He turned his back on them, a deliberate act of dismissal. "But we'll see you again in a few hours, Mr. Finch. Don't go anywhere." As he and Holloway walked away, the music seemed to falter. A DJ, sensing the shift in mood, faded the track. The vibrant, pulsating heart of the party was slowing, dying. The chatter of the crowd devolved into nervous whispers. All eyes were on Alistair and Portia, who stood frozen by the bar, illuminated in the cold, unforgiving light of the approaching dusk. The party was over. Driving back down the canyon, Holloway broke the silence. "The necklace. You really think it was hers? I'd bet my pension on it." Thorne set his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't just replace her. He's re-gifting her life. He felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Alistair's arrogance was going to be his downfall. He had handed them the justification they needed on a silver platter served with champagne and contempt. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they weren't just searching for a missing person anymore. When they returned and when the water level in that perfect turquoise pool began to drop, they were going to find a body. He was sure of it. The only question left was whose. Night had fully descended by the time the caravan of official vehicles returned to the Finch estate. The transition was jarring. The last of the party guests, a confused and disgruntled herd of socialites, were still filing out their expensive cars, forming a reluctant exodus down the long driveway. They were replaced by the stark, impersonal presence of the LAPD 2 marked patrol cars, the detective's sedan, and a large, unmarked van from the Forensic Services Unit. The house moments before a stage for defiant celebration was now a crime scene. Yellow tape, stark and clinical, was being unspooled, cordoning off the entire backyard. The festive string lights that hung over the patio now cast a sickly, interrogative glow on the uniforms and serious faces of the officers. Alistair Finch and Portia Montgomery stood in the cavernous living room framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the methodical invasion. Alistair was on the phone, his voice a low, furious growl. He was talking to his lawyer, a man whose name was synonymous with getting the rich and powerful out of trouble. Portia stood rigidly beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. The defiant fire in her eyes had been replaced by a brittle, flickering panic. The diamond necklace was gone from her throat, likely tucked away in a desperate, belated act of discretion. Detective Thorne presented the signed warrant to Alistair, who snatched it from his hand without a word. As Alistair scanned the document, his knuckles white. Thorne's attention was already outside. A heavy-duty pump was being unloaded from the forensic van, its thick hoses snaking across the manicured lawn towards the edge of the infinity pool. "You're really going to do this?" Portia's voice was barely a whisper. "You're going to tear this place apart based on a feeling we're going to follow the evidence," Ms. Montgomery Holloway corrected her coolly, "or the lack thereof. A missing woman of her means doesn't just fall off the face of the earth without leaving a digital or financial footprint. Her entire life just stopped. Right here." Holloway's gaze drifted toward the dark water. The pump coughed to life with a loud industrial roar, shattering the canyon's silence. It was a sound of finality. A large hose submerged with a splash, and water began to churn near the surface, before being sucked away, carried by another hose to a drain-off point down the hillside. The draining of the Finch pool had begun. The process was agonizingly slow. The pool was immense, holding tens of thousands of gallons of water. For the first hour, the change was almost imperceptible. The water level dropped by mere inches, the turquoise surface still placid and undisturbed under the glare of portable floodlights that the forensic team had set up. Thorne used the time to direct a preliminary search of the house. Officers, gloved and methodical, began in Genevieve's art studio. It was a space that felt distinctly different from the rest of the house. It was messy, vibrant, and alive. Canvases in various states of completion were stacked against the walls. Jars bristling with brushes stood on paint-spattered tables. And there, on the central easel, was Escape Velocity, the painting that had started the final fight. In the harsh light of the police flashlights, the slashes of crimson looked like fresh wounds. Holloway found something tucked into the frame of a large, empty canvas. It was a small folded piece of paper, a receipt. Not for art supplies, but for a burner phone purchased with cash 2 weeks before Genevieve disappeared. "Our old soul was getting modern," Holloway murmured, bagging the receipt. Meanwhile, outside, the pool continued to drain. The water level was noticeably lower now, exposing a line of pristine white tile that had been submerged. The top steps of the shallow end emerged glistening and bare. With every inch the water receded, the tension on the patio tightened like a screw. Alistair had ended his phone call and now stood with Portia and a newly arrived grim-faced lawyer in a tailored suit. They watched the proceedings with a mixture of contempt and terror. Thorne stood at the edge of the deep end, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the water, as if he could will it to reveal its secrets. Every bubble that rose to the surface, every ripple from the pump's vibration made his heart kick. He had staked his professional judgment on this. He had pushed for the warrant, convincing a skeptical judge that this flamboyant act of denial by Finch was more than just poor taste. It was the cover-up of a crime. If they found nothing, his credibility would be shot, and Alistair's lawyers would have a field day with a harassment lawsuit. 2 hours became 3. The water was now halfway down. The sleek built-in loungers in the shallow end were fully exposed, looking like skeletal remains. The pool's submerged lights began to poke through the surface, casting eerie upward-facing beams into the night sky. The roar of the pump was a constant mechanical drone. One of the uniformed officers pointed. "Detective, look." Thorne followed his gaze. Something was becoming visible in the deepest part of the pool, directly below the diving board. At first it was just a dark amorphous shape against the pool's light blue floor. As the water level sank lower, the shape began to resolve. It was large, dark, and irregular. Alistair took an involuntary step forward, his lawyer putting a restraining hand on his arm. Portia let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The pump kept roaring. The water receded further. The shape became clearer. It wasn't soft. It wasn't a body wrapped in a tarp as Thorne had morbidly pictured. It was hard-edged metallic. And then a recognizable form emerged from the distorting lens of the remaining water. It was the corner of something large and rectangular. It was covered in a dark, heavy-duty canvas, crudely weighted down by several large decorative stones that Thorne recognized from the landscaped garden beds nearby. The forensic team leader, a man named Diaz, gave the signal. The pump was shut off. The sudden deafening silence was more jarring than the noise. In that silence, all that could be heard was the distant hum of the city and the frantic pounding of Thorne's own heart. 2 officers, wearing waterproof waders, carefully descended the pool steps and sloshed through the knee-deep water towards the object. The water lapped against the sides of the canvas-covered shape. Thorne held his breath. This was it, the moment of truth. One of the officers reached the object, his gloved hands hesitating for a moment before gripping a corner of the heavy, wet canvas. He looked back at Thorne, who gave a sharp, decisive nod. With a deep breath, the officer pulled. The canvas, heavy with water, peeled back with a sucking sound. The floodlights hit the exposed surface. It wasn't the pale, tragic face of Genevieve Dubois. It was the deep, violent indigo and brutal crimson slashes of her painting, Escape Velocity. And submerged beneath it, pinned to the floor of the pool, was something else entirely. It was a man. Dressed in a dark security guard's uniform, his eyes wide open in a permanent state of surprise, a neat, unmistakable bullet hole in the center of his chest. The discovery of the body in the pool didn't just change the investigation, it detonated it. The man was quickly identified as Frank Miller, a 58-year-old retired cop who worked for the high-end security firm that patrolled Oak Haven Hills. He was the guard on duty the night Genevieve disappeared. His logbook found in the security booth at the entrance to the private road showed he'd checked in Alistair Finch upon his return earlier that evening. The last entry was at 10:15 p.m., a routine, all clear. Genevieve had stormed out around 11:00 p.m. The cause of death was obvious even before the coroner's report. He had been shot. The pool wasn't just a hiding place, it was a tomb, and Genevieve's painting her soul on canvas had been used as a shroud. The question that hung in the cold night air was as chilling as it was confounding. Where was Genevieve Dubois? And how did a security guard end up shot dead at the bottom of her swimming pool? Alistair Finch's composure finally catastrophically shattered. When Thorne confronted him with the identity of the dead man, Alistair's face went slack with what looked like genuine shock. Frank. Dead. No. No, that's impossible, he stammered, his eyes wide. He was a good man. He worked here for years. He was on duty the night Genevieve left. Thorne said, his voice like ice. And now he's dead in your pool and she's gone. You're going to have to do a lot better than impossible, Mr. Finch. Alistair, Portia, and their lawyer were immediately separated and taken downtown. The house was now under the full control of the forensics team. They worked through the night, the property glowing under the floodlights like a film set for a horror movie. The preliminary findings were baffling. The bullet that killed Frank Miller was from a .22 caliber pistol, a small, easily concealable weapon. A search of the house revealed Alistair owned several firearms, all large-caliber hunting rifles and shotguns, all locked securely in a gun safe to which he alone knew the combination. There was no .22 registered to him or Genevieve. The painting escape velocity was carefully lifted from the pool. Beneath it, the forensics team found a single shell casing. But something else lay near the body, partially hidden by one of the victim's hands. It was a small silver object tarnished by the chlorinated water. A key. Not a car key or a house key, but a small, old-fashioned skeleton key. In a sterile interrogation room under the hum of fluorescent lights, Portia Montgomery's carefully constructed facade crumbled into a million pieces. Faced with a potential accessory to murder charge, her loyalty to Alistair evaporated. I didn't know anything about a body, she insisted, her voice trembling. Alistair told me Genevieve just left. He said she was unstable, that she'd had a breakdown. And the party, Holloway asked, her voice deceptively soft. Whose idea was that? Portia sobbed, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. His. It was all his idea. He said it was the best way to control the narrative. To show everyone he wasn't worried that he was the wronged party. He said if he acted like a victim, the press would eat him alive, but if he acted like he was moving on, they'd just call him a cad and focus on finding her. And the necklace, Holloway pressed. He gave it to me that afternoon, Portia admitted, her voice dropping to a shameful whisper. He said Genevieve had left it behind, and that she didn't deserve to wear it anyway. He said it looked better on me. I was a fool. I know I was a fool. Alistair, in a separate room with Thorne and his lawyer, was a wall of furious denial. He claimed he had no idea how Frank Miller ended up in his pool. He stuck to his story. Genevieve had stormed out after their fight, and he hadn't seen her since. The party was, as he'd claimed, a way to project strength. So you're saying an armed security guard was shot on your property, dragged to your pool, and dumped in all without you hearing a thing? Thorne asked, incredulous. This house is soundproofed. I was in my bedroom on the other side of the estate. I took a sleeping pill. I heard nothing. Alistair spat back. And the painting? Why use her painting to hide the body? Alistair's eyes flickered for a moment. I have no idea. Maybe the killer hated her art as much as I did. The callousness of the remark was chilling. The investigation was now a Gordian knot. They had a victim, a murder weapon they couldn't find, and a prime suspect who was either a Machiavellian genius or the unluckiest man in the world. And they still had a missing woman. Was Genevieve a second victim, her body dumped elsewhere? Or was she somehow the killer? The idea seemed preposterous. But the burner phone receipt suggested she was planning something. The breakthrough came from the one person who knew Genevieve's soul better than anyone, her friend the sculptor Maya. When Thorne and Holloway visited her studio in Topanga Canyon, a chaotic, welcoming space that smelled of clay and incense, she was pale with grief and fear. They showed her a photo of the skeleton key found in the pool. Her eyes widened. "I've seen it before," she said, her voice trembling. Jen wore it on a thin silver chain around her neck. She never took it off. She said it was her escape key, escape from what Holloway asked. Maya hesitated, twisting a piece of clay in her hands. From him, from Alistair. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a real key. She led them to a large abstract metal sculpture in the corner of her studio. She pointed to a small, almost invisible seam near the base. She was a genius, you know, not just with paint, with everything. Maya worked her fingers into the seam and pulled. A small, perfectly concealed door swung open. Inside the hollow base of the sculpture was a small metal lockbox. Maya looked at the detectives. "She told me if anything ever happened to her, if she ever disappeared, and I felt in my gut that something was wrong, I should open this." She said the key was the one thing Alistair could never take from her. Holloway took the skeleton key, which had been carefully cleaned and bagged, and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a soft metallic click. She lifted the lid. Inside there was no confession, no diary, no smoking gun in the traditional sense. Instead there was a stack of professionally printed credit cards and a pristine California driver's license. The photo was of Genevieve, but her hair was cut short and dyed a mousy brown. The name on the documents was not Genevieve Dubois. It was Amelia Shaw. Beneath the documents was a burner phone, the one from the receipt, and a thick file folder. Holloway opened it. It was filled with what looked like financial statements, offshore bank records, and encrypted transaction logs. They were all under Alistair's name, but they were for accounts his lawyers would swear didn't exist. It was a meticulously documented portfolio of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, detailing how Alistair Finch had built a significant portion of his legitimate empire on a foundation of pure crime. And tucked into the back of the folder was a single sheet of paper. On it, in Genevieve's elegant handwriting, was a list of names. The first name on the list was Frank Miller. Beside his name was a note. "He knows. He helped him. He's the first one I need to talk to." Genevieve Dubois hadn't had a breakdown. She hadn't been kidnapped or killed. She had been building a case. She had been planning to burn Alistair's entire world to the ground. And on the night she vanished, she had gone to confront the first domino she intended to knock over. The only question was, what happened when she did? The contents of the lockbox turned the case on its head. Genevieve Dubois wasn't a victim in the way they had imagined. She was a meticulous, patient hunter who had been stalking her prey for months, perhaps years. The file on Alistair was a work of art in its own right, a masterpiece of corporate espionage conducted from inside the gilded cage he had built for her. Detective Thorne spread the documents across the large table in the precinct's main briefing room. "She wasn't running away," he said to his team, a new respect for the missing woman in his voice. "She was preparing for war." The file detailed a complex web of shell corporations, illegal wire transfers, and insider trading that implicated not just Alistair, but several members of his company's board, the same men he'd wanted to impress by taking down her painting. Genevieve had somehow gained access to his encrypted servers, his hidden ledgers. She had everything. The note about Frank Miller was the key. Why did she need to talk to him? What did he know? A deep dive into Miller's financials provided the answer. For the past 5 years, Miller had been receiving a monthly payment of $10,000 from a holding company that the file revealed was secretly controlled by Alistair. It wasn't a salary. It was a retainer. It was hush money. The focus of the investigation shifted from Alistair as a potential murderer to Alistair as the head of a criminal enterprise, and Portia Montgomery, the ambitious lawyer, was suddenly viewed in a new light. How much did she know? Was she just a mistress, or was she the consigliere? When Holloway confronted Portia with the new evidence, her composure, already fragile, completely disintegrated. She had been played just as much as everyone else. Offshore accounts fraud. She asked, her face pale with disbelief. No. Alistair is aggressive in business, but he's not a criminal. He's too smart for that. He's smart enough to have a bagman on his security detail. Holloway countered, sliding a copy of Frank Miller's bank statement across the table, and smart enough to get his girlfriend to host a party for him while a dead body decomposes in his pool. The question is, are you smart enough, Ms. Montgomery, to save yourself? Portia stared at the numbers, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had hitched her wagon to a man who wasn't just a philanderer, but a major felon. Her legal career, her reputation, her entire future was about to be incinerated. The night she left Portia, began, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair called me. He was frantic. Not the cold, in-control man I knew. He was terrified. He said, "She knows. I don't know how, but she knows everything." He told me to come to the house, but to park down the street and come in through the back gate. What time was this? Around midnight. When I got there, he was in the backyard by the pool. He was drenched in sweat. He told me Genevieve had confronted him, that she had proof of business dealings. He said she threatened to ruin him. And then he said she just left. Did you believe him? Portia shook her head. No. There was something in his eyes. He kept looking at the pool. The pieces were beginning to fit, forming a dark and twisted picture. Thorne and Holloway theorized a new timeline. The fight over the painting was just the prelude. The real confrontation happened later. Genevieve, armed with her evidence, had finally shown Alistair her hand, telling him she was going to expose him. In his rage and panic, he had lashed out. But that didn't explain Frank Miller. The answer came from an unlikely source, a motion-activated security camera on the property of the film producer who had called in the noise complaint. His property overlooked the Finch estate from above. His cameras, designed to catch coyotes or intruders, had a clear, if distant, view of Alistair's backyard. The producer, eager to help nail his obnoxious neighbor, gladly handed over the footage. Thorne and Holloway watched the grainy black and white video in a darkened room. The timestamp in the corner of the screen provided an objective silent witness. At 11:05 p.m., they see Genevieve's Mercedes convertible driving away down the long driveway. Alistair's story so far held up. For the next hour, nothing. The patio is empty, the pool still. Then at 12:15 a.m., a figure walks into frame. It's a man in a security uniform, Frank Miller. He walks to the edge of the pool and peers down into the deep end as if looking for something. He has a flashlight in his hand. A few moments later, a second figure emerges from the house. Alistair. He approaches Miller, and though there's no audio, their body language is tense. They are arguing. Alistair points towards the driveway, then back at the house. Miller shakes his head. Then the video shows something that makes Thorne's blood run cold. A third figure appears. She slips out of the shadows near the art studio, a place the camera barely reaches. She is slight, moving with a quiet grace. It's Genevieve Dubois. She hadn't left. She had sent her car away or had someone else drive it and circled back. She approaches the two men who have their backs to her. She is holding something small in her hand. There's a flash so brief it's almost missed, and Frank Miller crumples to the ground. Alistair spins around, his face a mask of horror. He sees Genevieve holding a small pistol. She says something to him, her expression cold and resolute. He backs away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The camera then shows Genevieve directing Alistair. He, looking utterly terrified of the woman he once dominated, helps her roll Miller's body onto a large canvas. The painting, and together, under her armed supervision, They struggle to push the heavy shrouded corpse into the pool. It sinks slowly, grotesquely into the deep end. The final scene on the tape is the most chilling. Genevieve stands at the edge of the pool, the gun still in her hand. She looks at Alistair for a long moment, then turns and walks back into the shadows of the studio, disappearing from view. A few minutes later, Portia Montgomery appears, walking into a scene of a crime she didn't even know had been committed. Thorne leaned back in his chair, stunned. "My God," he whispered. "He wasn't lying. He is scared of her. He didn't kill anyone. He's an accessory." Holloway said, her voice grim. "She made him help her cover it up." Genevieve Dubois wasn't a victim or a warrior for justice. She was a killer. She had gone there to confront Miller, her first domino, but the confrontation had turned deadly. She had executed him, and then she had implicated her husband in the crime, binding him to her not with love or law, but with a shared terrible secret. The party wasn't Alistair's idea of a celebration. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to create a veneer of normalcy over a foundation of terror, all under the direction of a woman who was now holding his entire life and his freedom in her hands. She hadn't vanished. She was hiding in plain sight, pulling the strings. And the police had no idea where she was. The video footage transformed Alistair Finch from a prime suspect into a hostage. When Thorne and Holloway confronted him with the tape, the relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost pathetic. His blustering, arrogant demeanor dissolved, replaced by the raw, unvarnished fear of a man who had been living in a nightmare. His confession, when it came, was a torrent of panicked words. "She was going to kill me," he said, his voice trembling in the interrogation room. His lawyer sat beside him, silent and grim, knowing the best legal strategy was now full, unadorned cooperation. After she shot Frank, she pointed the gun at me. She was so calm. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was like all the passion, all the anger, all the life had been boiled out of her, and all that was left was this cold purpose. He recounted the night's events from his perspective. The fight over the painting had been real, but it was just the surface. Later that evening, she had confronted him with the file. She laid out his entire criminal enterprise with chilling accuracy. "She told me she didn't want the money," Alistair said, shaking his head in disbelief. "She said she wanted to watch me lose everything. She wanted me to live the rest of my life with nothing. She said she was going to start with my accomplices, that she was going to dismantle my empire one person at a time, and she was going to make me watch." He confirmed she had arranged for a friend to drive her car to Venice to create a false trail while she hid in the studio waiting. Her target was Frank Miller. Why him? "What did he do?" Thorne asked. Alistair looked down at his hands. "Years ago there was an incident. A business deal that went bad. Someone got hurt. A rival. Frank was on duty. He saw what happened. I paid him to keep quiet to make sure the official record was clean. Genevieve must have found the payment records. She knew Frank was my first sin. She said if she could make him talk, the rest would unravel. But Miller refused to talk. When Genevieve confronted him by the pool, he had laughed in her face, telling her Alistair's money was worth more than her threats. He had sealed his own fate. After she shot him, Alistair continued, "She told me that this was the new arrangement, that I was now part of her plan. She made me help her hide the body. She said if I went to the police, she would produce a recording she'd made of me confessing to the murder. She said she'd tell them I killed Frank to silence him, and then she vanished, making it look like I had killed her too. It was my word against hers, and she had the gun." The next week had been torture. Genevieve was hiding somewhere in the vast house, moving silently through hidden passages and guest rooms he hadn't entered in years. She would appear at random, a ghost in her own home, to give him instructions. The call to the police, the script of what to say, even the party, it was all her idea. The party, Holloway asked, skeptical. She said it was a masterstroke. Alistair explained, a flicker of his old admiration for cunning strategy in his eyes. She said no one would believe a grieving man would throw a party, so they wouldn't suspect he was being coerced. They would just think he was a monster. She wanted them to find the body. She wanted me to be the only one there, the obvious suspect. It was all designed to corner me, to make me so desperate I would have no choice but to do exactly what she said. Her plan was to use him, her puppet, to liquidate his illegal assets, transfer the clean money to an account of her choosing, and then she would disappear forever, leaving him to face the fallout from a murder he didn't commit, and a financial empire that was now a house of cards. The confession gave the police a clear picture of the killer, but they still didn't have her. The house was searched again, this time by a SWAT team from the wine cellar to the attic. They found a small makeshift living space in a forgotten staff suite in the basement, complete with blankets, bottled water, and energy bars. They also found a laptop wiped clean. But Genevieve was gone. She had slipped away while the house was being swarmed. They had Alistair's testimony, but it was the word of a compromised, terrified man. They needed Genevieve. They needed the murder weapon. The final piece of the puzzle came from Maya the sculptor. Racked with guilt, she called Thorne, her voice choked with tears. "She called me," Maya cried. "Jen called me from her burner phone. She's at the studio. My studio. She needs me to drive her to the airport. Stall her," Thorne commanded. "Tell her you're on your way. Do not let her know you've talked to us." The raid on Maya's Topanga Canyon studio was silent and swift. Plainclothes officers surrounded the property, hidden amongst the eucalyptus trees and dense chaparral. Thorne and Holloway, wearing tactical vests, took the lead. They found her in the main workspace, standing next to the metal sculpture that had held her secrets. She was dressed in practical, anonymous clothing, jeans, a dark hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low over her mousy brown hair. The transformation from the glamorous artist to Amelia Shaw was complete. She held a small go bag in one hand. She didn't seem surprised to see them. She simply looked up, her face calm, her eyes holding a deep, weary sadness. She didn't run. "It's over, isn't it?" she said, her voice quiet. "It is," Genevieve Holloway said softly. Genevieve looked at the sculpture, her hand resting on its cool metal surface. "He took everything from me," she said, not to the detectives, but to the room, to the universe. "My art, my spirit, my name. He tried to turn me into just another one of his possessions. I tried to build a case against him to do it the right way. But when I confronted Frank Miller and he just laughed, something broke. I realized the system Alistair owned would never convict him. To beat a monster, you have to become one." She then reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out the .22 caliber pistol. She didn't point it at them. Instead, she laid it carefully on a workbench next to a lump of clay. Her confession was in her surrender. As they cuffed her, Thorne looked at her, at the woman who had outplayed a master manipulator, who had committed murder with ice-cold precision, and who had orchestrated a week of pure psychological terror. He saw the artist, the victim, the strategist, and the killer all residing in one shattered soul. She had fought to escape the gilded cage, but in the end she had only managed to build a new one, one with bars made of iron and a sentence that would last a lifetime. The trial was a media circus, a lurid spectacle dubbed the Gilded Cage Killing by the press. It had everything: wealth, betrayal, and a murder captured on grainy surveillance footage. In exchange for his full testimony, Alistair Finch received a reduced sentence of 12 years for being an accessory to murder and for a litany of federal financial crimes. The man who once ruled a corporate empire from a glass fortress now spent his days in a concrete box. His company collapsed and his name a permanent synonym for ruin. Portia Montgomery, granted full immunity for her testimony, vanished from the public eye, her career derailed. Maya the sculptor was never charged and later created a powerful series of sculptures inspired by the events titled The Key and the Cage. Genevieve Dubois's defense tried to paint her as a victim of coercive control who finally snapped. But the jury saw the video, the cold calculation, the woman who had not just lost control, but taken it in the most final way possible. They found her guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, calling her actions a chilling perversion of justice, sentenced her to life in prison without parole. In the end, everyone lost. An innocent man was dead. Alistair lost his freedom, and Genevieve lost her soul. The house in Oakhaven Hills was sold. Its infamous pool immediately filled in by the new owners. Sometimes Detective Thorne would drive through the canyons and think of Genevieve's words. To beat a monster, you have to become one. She had succeeded, but in the process created a tragedy far greater than the one she sought to escape. The story of Alistair Finch and Genevieve Dubois is a dark reminder that behind the shimmering facades of wealth and power, the human heart can be a very dark place. It's a story of how control can become abuse, how a cry for justice can become a quest for vengeance, and how the fight to escape one prison can lead you directly into another. They were both monsters locked in a dance of destruction, and their story ended the only way it could, in ruin. What did you think of this tragic story? Who do you think was the greater villain? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as compelling and chilling as I did, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good real-life drama, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the most shocking cases. Thank you for listening.